Welcome to Blaise Castle House Museum. This film will take you on a tour of Blaise Castle estate through time, charting the changes to the estate and its occupants from the 1700s to today. In the 1700s there were two large manor houses on this estate, the Great House and a more recent house which stood where the dairy garden is now. This engraving from 1712 shows the Great House, which was built in the mid-1600s and demolished in around 1830. It had formal gardens laid out in the Tudor style. In 1766 the estate was owned by Thomas Farr, a Bristol merchant. He built the current Blaise Castle as a summer house in which to entertain his guests. Blaise Castle is mentioned in Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen's first novel, which was written in 1799. This photograph shows the interior of the castle in about 1900. At this time it was a summer house, but it was later lived in by various members of the estate staff, including the woodsman and his family. In 1789, the estate was bought by a wealthy bank director and brass merchant from Bristol, John Scandrett Harford. He paid £11,000, which is the equivalent of around £600,000 today. The Harford family came to live at Blaise, in the house which stood where the dairy garden is now, in the summer of 1790. Harford set about building a new house and making changes to the estate. He hired Bristol's premier architect, William Patey. The house Patey designed was very plain to fit with Harford's belief as a Quaker in restraint. Blaise Castle House was completed in 1798 and the old house was demolished soon after. This watercolour shows the old house which stood where the dairy garden is now, into which the Harfords moved in 1790. And this is the same page with a flap drawn back to reveal the new house built by William Patey. These paintings are from the Red Book for Blaise, a portfolio which was produced by Humphry Repton in 1796, when he was hired by Harford to make improvements to the estate. Repton was the leading landscape architect of his day. He was a leader in the fashionable, picturesque style of gardening. This was less formal than earlier styles and used nature as inspiration. This is a plan of the estate as Repton redesigned it. He laid a new drive through the woods so that the house could be approached without visitors seeing any of the other large mansions in Henbury village. Repton built a new entrance with a castellated lodge on Henbury Road through which carriages entered the drive. The drive then wound through the woods past several cottages added by Repton before sweeping up out of the woods to the house. Repton intended that the castellated lodge would trick visitors into expecting a Gothic mansion, so that they were surprised and delighted by the modern, elegant house. The drive is now a footpath, so you can walk along it and approach the house as Repton intended. This illustration shows two figures looking over the estate. Perhaps the man in bright clothing is intended to be Repton, and the figure in sober black to be John Scandrett Harford. When the main house was completed, work began on several additional buildings. William Patey designed the stables in 1800. After Patey's death that year, the subsequent buildings were designed by John Nash, who designed Carlton House and Regent Street. Nash oversaw the building of the dairy, the Orangery with laundry behind it, and the cottages in Blaise Hamlet. The dairy was built in 1804. It was a working dairy, but was also a showpiece. The Orangery was built in 1806. It was filled with exotic plants. There was a spacious laundry behind it, with separate rooms for washing, ironing and mangling. The Orangery screened the laundry and the servants' wing from the garden. Blaise Hamlet is a group of 9 cottages which were built in 1811. They housed employees of the Harfords. The cottages were superior to most at that time, as each had its own privy, oven and copper for washing. Blaise Hamlet is now owned by the National Trust and the cottages are private residences. Visitors can walk around the green, however, and see the outsides of the cottages. The hamlet is about 5 minutes' walk away from the museum. From 1798 this was a family home. John Scandrett Harford lived here with his wife Mary and their 9 children. The family lived in the main part of the house, which is now open to the public as the museum. Downstairs there was a double-ended drawing room along the side of the house facing the castle, a dining room at the back of the house with French windows onto the terrace, and a library and study. The rest of the ground floor made up the servants' quarters. There was a kitchen with scullery and larder adjoining, a large servants' hall where the lower servants ate their meals, and private rooms for the butler and housekeeper. On the first floor there were 4 large bedrooms, each with its own dressing room. These are now the upstairs galleries of the museum. Above the servants' wing there were 9 further smaller bedrooms which would have been used by the younger children and their nurses. There was also a schoolroom here in which the girls and the younger boys would have been taught. On the second floor there were 7 servants' bedrooms and 2 storerooms. Beneath the ground floor are the cellars. These would have been used for storage. John Scandrett Harford died in 1815 and his widow Mary continued to live at Blaise. John Scandrett Harford Jr, the eldest son, inherited Blaise on his father's death. At that time the estate was valued at £300,000, the equivalent of about £12.5 million today. Although he worked in the family banking business, John Scandrett Harford Jr was a rather different man from his father. He left the Quaker faith in 1807 and pursued interests in art, classical scholarship, and the causes of the day, such as the abolition of the slave trade. When he was 25, Harford Jr fell in love with Louisa Hart Davis. She was only 16 at the time, but they married when Louisa was 18. Following Harford Sr.'s death in 1815, the young couple embarked on a grand European tour. During their travels, Harford Jr collected works of art and statuary, which he sent home to Blaise. Following his mother's death in 1830, Harford Jr and Louisa moved into Blaise Castle House and set about making alterations. Harford Jr commissioned Charles Cockerell to design the picture room which was built onto the back of the house. Cockerell also added balustrades and urns to the terrace, a portico to the front door, and an arcade above the staircase. Statues and reliefs which Harford Jr had collected while abroad were put up around the walls. The picture room was built to house Harford Jr.'s art collection and to provide a venue for Louisa's musical soirees. It was hung with over 30 paintings, and the Harfords produced a catalogue to help their guests enjoy them. The couple had no children. They employed a staff of 10 indoor servants, plus gardeners and estate workers. John Scandrett Harford Jr died in 1866. Louisa remained at Blaise until her death in 1872, aged 78. As Harford Jr and Louisa had no children, Blaise was inherited by their eldest nephew, John Battersby Harford. He had married Mary de Bunsen in 1850. They had 8 children and lived at Lampeter in Wales. For the next 20 years, the house was looked after by a small group of servants while the owners lived in Wales. John Battersby Harford died in 1875 and his widow Mary continued to live in Lampeter. At some point in the 1890s, she moved to Blaise with her 3 unmarried daughters, Alice, Agnes and Charlotte. This photograph shows Mary and her family on the terrace behind the house in 1909, celebrating Mary's 80th birthday. The passageway behind the family originally connected the house with the orangery and laundry, but has since been demolished. These are 3 of Mary's grandchildren playing in the orangery. Their names are Molly, Johnny and George Arthur. Johnny was killed in the First World War. Mary and her daughters lived at Blaise until Mary's death in 1919, aged 90. She was buried in Henbury churchyard. The 3 sisters moved to Bath, perhaps to avoid the expense of running such a large house. Blaise was sold to the Bristol Corporation, the forerunner of Bristol City Council. Most of the contents of the house were sold at auction. After 1919, the house was unoccupied and the estate became a public park. This is the Dickens family enjoying a picnic on the lawn in front of the orangery around 1930. This photograph shows Brian Coombs, aged about 4½, in the summer of 1934. He is standing on the wall at the front of the house. He was at Blaise for a day trip with his mother Doris and his older brothers Peter and Roy. The family were poor in the 1930s, as Brian's father had deserted them, leaving Doris and her mother to bring up the boys alone. In the 1930s, the picture room was opened as a tea room. Special crockery was made for the tea room by a local firm, Pountney's. Later, there was a children's paddling pool on the lawn at the front of the house. During the Second World War, the house was occupied by the armed forces. There are marks on the floor in the hall made by a pile of sandbags. In 1949, the house was opened as the Museum of West Country Rural Life. The early displays depicted country life, such as this farmhouse kitchen scene. This photo from the 1960s shows women wearing some of the Victorian dresses in the museum collection. This risks damaging the dresses and wouldn't be allowed today. Today, thousands of people visit the museum every year to see the displays, take part in public events, and even to get married.